The owner of this phone stated that the phone suddenly shut off. There was no drops involved, no water damage, no heavy hits. It just suddenly stopped working. We've removed the back already so we can get at the internals, so that we can also take out the motherboard. This is the iQOO Neo 5, but this type of failure is common among the Qualcomm Snapdragon CPUs. Based on the description that the owner has given, I'm pretty sure that it's going to be an issue with the CPU itself. In order to get at the CPU, we need to carefully remove this copper sticker. It doesn't like to come off, so typically gets destroyed in the process. And we'll want to clean up the thermal paste that's being compressed against it. This is a very similar issue to the Qualcomm Snapdragon 888. Basically what happens after a year or two of use, the solder joints under the CPU become weak. Issues like not turning on, rebooting, no baseband, no Wi-Fi can be a result of this type of issue. We're using a number 11 scalpel. We'll use a number 11 blade along with a hot air gun at 280 degrees Celsius to carefully remove the underfill around the CPU, being careful not to damage any of the surrounding components. This blade's tip is small enough that it can fit in between those gaps and help us to remove it. Now, using our hot air gun at 380 degrees Celsius, we're going to carefully lift up the RAM off the top of the CPU by gently sliding in our tool, waiting for it to let go as to not damage the RAM. And while it's still warm, we'll do the exact same thing to remove the CPU, carefully waiting for it to want to lift off. After removing the CPU, we need to clean up the motherboard using a soldering iron at 350 degrees Celsius with some low melt solder and a flux. We'll be able to carefully mix the low melt with the factory solder, making it so that we can remove as much of the solder as possible, and go in with some wick and carefully remove all of the solder, both the low melt and the factory solder. In this process, we will also be cleaning up the underfill, and doing this process helps remove the underfill, but not fully. Carefully go in with our hot air at 280 degrees Celsius with a scraping tool and carefully and gently scrape away the remaining underfill without scratching the top of the motherboard. And we'll go and do that on all sides until we have a nice clean surface. And we're going to use the same method on the actual RAM and CPU itself, adding some flux, using some low melt to mix with the factory solder until we've removed the majority of it. Then, using our heat at 280 degrees Celsius, we'll carefully use our scraping tool to scrape away the underfill that's on the bottom of this RAM. Now we'll turn attention to the CPU using a soldering iron at 350 degrees Celsius. Along with some flux and low melt soldering wire, we'll clean up the CPU pads in a very similar way. This is a double-sided component, so we do need to flip it over and address the same side that the RAM will sit on by going through the same steps and carefully removing all of the underfill. If we don't remove this underfill, it'll be nearly impossible to reball and install properly. Using our hot air at 280 degrees Celsius again. We'll turn it back over and look at the bottom of the CPU. As you can see, the caps are just getting shoved aside. These can kind of get in the way of reballing and reinstalling it, and they're not really necessary for what we found. So we'll just remove them along with all of the underfill and old flux. I'm going to fold over a paper towel so that we can have a more flat surface with the stencil, and we'll line it up with the BGA. We'll apply some 217 high temperature solder paste to the CPU. Take a microfiber cloth and we'll clean up all of the remaining solder paste and help with the flux. We'll come in with 300 degrees Celsius hot air and we will reball the bottom of the CPU. We're going to do the same thing with the bottom of the RAM. We'll line up our stencil. Take some 217 degrees solder paste and reball it in the exact same fashion. Before installing the chip onto the motherboard, let's first check the current on the motherboard and its outputs. This will prevent any secondary damage to the motherboard when we go to power it on. The device has a dual battery structure with a maximum voltage of 7.74 volts. We connect a soldering wire to the positive terminal of the motherboard battery and then attach a black clip to the motherboard ground and negative terminal. Let's press the power button and trigger the interface spring clips. Using something metal that's conductive, we use a 6.2 regulated power supply, and we can observe that the current fluctuates between 0 and 90 milliamps back and forth. This was observed without the CPU installed. The motherboard current is generally similar for models after the Qualcomm 855. After confirming that there are no issues, we can proceed by adding a small amount of flux, making sure we get an even coating over the motherboard, lining up the CPU in the proper orientation, and then using hot air at 380 degrees Celsius, we can carefully install the CPU. Once we know that the solder is liquid, we'll use the tip of a tweezer and we'll gently nudge it, making sure that it snaps into place. We can do another test to see if we have now installed the CPU properly. What we're going to be looking for is a spike between 0 and 200 milliamp hours. What we're going to be looking for is fluctuation between 0 and 200 ohms. This will help us know that we've installed the CPU properly. We'll add some flux to the top of the CPU in the exact same way we did with the motherboard, so that we can install the upper ROM. Line it up in the proper orientation, and we're going to solder it down in the exact same way, giving it the very slightest nudge when we know that it's kind of dropped into place. Just like that. You can remove the wire. We're going to apply some new thermal paste, and we're going to take some copper foil tape and we're going to apply it over the top of the thermal paste. And then inside the frame of the phone we're going to do the same thing by removing the old thermal paste and applying some new thermal paste. and you can see that we have successfully made it so this iQOO board boots once again. A very common issue on a lot of different devices, Android and iOS devices included, where understanding how to reball and reinstall the CPU and RAM if needed helps with this repair. Thanks a ton for watching. We'll see you in the next video.